Printing a sewing pattern from home is really convenient, but sometimes it can be pretty tricky to make heads or tails out of all the pieces and puzzle them together. Hi, I'm Adrienne from Sew PDF, and I'm going to show you how to walk through all of the steps to put together a PDF pattern so you can get it assembled quickly and get onto your sewing. Okay, step one, make sure you have printed the pattern correctly. This is super important, and all PDF patterns will have some kind of scale square on them that you can measure to make sure that it's printed accurately. There are also a few printer errors that show up sometimes that can turn curved lines into angled lines, which can make it really difficult to piece your pattern together. So if you're new to printing patterns, I recommend watching my video about printing patterns accurately first, and I've linked that up here for you. Another part of the printing process is making sure that you've printed all of the correct pages. And when you first look at a PDF pattern, you might get a little overwhelmed thinking, do I need to print all of these pages? Some of them will have 40, 50 pages. But in most cases, unless you're making complicated adult clothing, no, there's no way you need to print that many pages. Often the tutorial will be combined with the print pages, so you don't need to print the tutorial. You can read it off of a computer screen or a tablet. So you only need to print the actual pattern piece pages. And then also a lot of PDF patterns have multiple options. They have lots of different sizes. And so unless you're making the biggest size, then you most likely don't need all the pages. As far as options, for example, a lot of patterns have multiple sleeve lengths, so you may only need the pages for the short sleeve, or maybe it has a hood option and you're not making the hood, so you don't need those pages. And most PDF patterns with lots of options will also include a pages to print chart in the tutorial. So if you look at the tutorial, there should be a chart on one of the pages that shows exactly what pages you need to print for your size and for your options. Now, if the pattern doesn't have a lot of options, then sometimes they don't include a pages to print chart. And there are some ways that you can kind of figure out if you might be able to skip printing some of the pages. So one way is by looking at the assembly layout. All patterns should have a layout guide somewhere, either in the tutorial or sometimes it's on one of the pattern pieces itself, which will be a grid that shows which page numbers need to be taped together. In this grid, if you look closely at it, often you can tell that, okay, maybe there's a hood on these 4 pages, so I don't need those pages. Another way is to use the layers. Most PDF patterns have something called layers where you can actually turn off the sizes that you don't need by unchecking those layers in Adobe Reader. And if you uncheck all the sizes that you don't need, then you can actually scroll through the file. And if you see any blank pages, then you know that you don't need to print that page. Okay, so step 2, after you've got all your pages printed correctly, choose your weapon. Tape or glue stick. Personally, I have tried both and I prefer tape, but many people do swear that glue sticks are easier. It is definitely easier to be able to adjust the pages slightly if maybe you didn't put them together quite correctly the first time. But I also find that they don't adhere as well, and so sometimes once the glue dries, the pages might come apart. I'm also just much faster with tape, but to each their own. For step 3, I recommend laying out your pages according to the assembly layout grid before you start sticking or taping them together. There's a few reasons why I recommend doing this. One is you can easily double check to make sure you have all the pages that you need. Maybe you accidentally missed one. And then also, if it's a large pattern, you may actually be able to assemble it in sections. So if you lay it out in advance, then you can kind of section off the pages that go together, and then it doesn't take up as much space on your table or your floor to tape together just a section at a time instead of the entire pattern grid. In this example here, the 3 columns on the right form the sleeve, so those can be assembled completely separately. They don't need to be stuck to the first 4 columns. Okay, we're on step 4, which is where you actually start sticking things together. But there are a number of different assembly methods, so you need to figure out which ones work with your pattern type and which assembly method you'd like to use, because often several of these options will work. The 2 main assembly options are trim or no trim, but there are a bunch of different variations on these. Trim patterns typically have a large white border that is intended to be trimmed off with scissors, or you could use a paper cutter. Lining up the edges of a trim pattern is pretty simple because the rectangles are simply placed side by side and taped together. You can't use glue if you are trimming all the edges, but most people choose not to trim all of the edges. The second main type is called no trim or trimless patterns, and these are designed to have the pages overlap. So the pattern does go closer to the edges because it does help you overlap them more easily. Pattern designers use a wide variety of markers and alignment guides to make sure that you're overlapping them in the correct spot. I do want to quickly mention that there is a very rare third option called edge-to-edge patterns, and these are designed to tape two pages together without any trimming or overlap. But the reason that this method is rare is because it can be very inaccurate if your printer alignment isn't exactly correct. So if your printer is pulling in the paper and it's printing it slightly over from where it should be, then your pattern can be inaccurate. Let's start by looking at trim patterns with the white edges. Now, as I mentioned, the traditional way to put these together is to trim all of the edges and then just tape them together. This does take a lot more time than the other methods, but it does have one advantage in that it does fold up and store more easily than when you overlap the patterns. Another method is to trim just two of the edges instead of all of the edges. And this allows you to overlap, but still match up those rectangles exactly. Generally, you want to trim the left side and the top side of the paper, which will make it easy to work your way from left to right and from top to bottom when you're assembling your grid. A slight variation on this method is to fold your edges under instead of trimming them off. This is faster, but it's also a lot more bulky. So if you want a faster method that isn't quite so bulky, then I recommend cutting the corners diagonally. You can layer a bunch of pages together and then cut the corners, which is really fast to do, and it makes it super easy to align all of the corners. This is going to leave some blank spaces, but if you're missing any important lines, then you can put the pattern on a window and just trace through what is missing from underneath. If you really don't want to cut anything, including the corners, you can just look through the paper and overlap it. A window is really helpful in being able to see through the paper, but in a well-lit room, you usually can see a little bit from underneath without having to put it on the window. Okay, let's take a closer look at some trimless patterns. As I mentioned, these do not have the white border, although they will often have a slight little margin because most printers will not print all the way to the edge. Although some printers do have a borderless setting that you can check to make it print all the way to the edges, but it usually takes much longer to print when you use the borderless setting. And that tiny margin that you're missing generally doesn't have any important information, but if it does, you could put it up on a window to fill it in. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. Here's a pattern that has a simple rectangle grid around it, so you're simply going to overlap those lines and tape or glue it in place. This pattern here has a dashed line on just two sides of the pattern. And this line actually indicates where the edge of the paper needs to go if there is perfect printer alignment. With alignment guides like this, where you're not actually overlapping the line, you're butting up the edge of the paper next to the line, you always want to make sure that your other markers on the page are correctly overlapped. So it's got these circles with the letters and numbers, so you want to make sure that those are overlapped perfectly. And if the edge of the paper doesn't match up with that line, then it could be printer alignment or your scale might be off. So if you didn't already double check your scale square, then make sure to double check that. If it's correct, then it's just a printer alignment issue and you can go ahead and overlap these circles and letters and you'll be fine. Here's another pattern. This one actually includes a full rectangle that can be trimmed for those who like to trim their patterns. And it also includes a red line, which, like the pattern we just looked at, is meant for the paper to be butted up against it. But as I mentioned, you want to pay attention to those other markers. Those circles need to overlap perfectly, and that is more important than the red lines. If the red lines aren't working for you, you can actually turn that layer off and not even print those red lines at all on patterns from Buttons and Blueprints and Goober P Designs, who both use the same template. Once you've figured out your assembly method, go ahead and assemble all of your pages. But as I mentioned, you can assemble it in sections, so if there's a piece on a page that doesn't connect to other pieces, you don't need to stick them together. And step 5, once you've got your pattern all assembled, is to cut out your pattern pieces. You can use scissors to do this, or if you have a cutting mat, I like to use a rotary cutter that is marked for only using with paper, because cutting paper will dull the blade and then it won't work very well on fabric. So that's how it's done. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And if all of this seems like too much work for you, There is another option. My next video in this series is going to be about how to get your pattern printed at a copy shop or a specialty sewing shop with a large format printer. Most PDF patterns do come with a large format file that can be printed on blueprint size paper. So when that video is ready, I will link it up here. But in the meantime, I have linked a blog post down in the description of this video that talks about where you can get these large format files printed and what you need to know when you do that. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions about using PDF patterns for beginners, drop it in the comments and I'll make sure to reply.